Good night, Seth. I feel real good, and Seth did well finishing that material, Jane said. I feel good about heroics, too. Before the session, I was worried about what good stuff we might get and whether we could put it in this book, or if it would just lay there for years. But something you said helped. That I don't worry about things like that anymore. I repeated, I discovered I don't want to spend the time being concerned. So I've changed my beliefs. I can't do that any longer. Whereupon Jane loudly and humorously returned, as Seth, leaning forward for emphasis, her eyes wide and dark. You never should have worried, and neither should Jane. The book sessions will cover everything that needs to be covered. I know it, I said as Seth stared at me. Then he was gone. But I told Jane, with some humor of my own, I also knew that knowledge wouldn't stop me from occasionally inserting what I think is a particularly good and appropriate non-book session into whatever project Seth may have going at the time. She laughed. Last Thursday, Jane and I received from Prentice Hall our first copies of the German translation of Seth Speaks. And I'm not going to go into all this. I'm going to go to where this dictation begins. Okay. Dictation on Wednesday. Now, earlier today, Rupert wondered if I might dictate more in reply to your scientist letter. As he wondered, I very briefly responded to the effect that since we come from such different perspectives, it is actually quite difficult to give your scientist what I would consider a full response. I could dictate a reply that would satisfy him well enough, but it would, perhaps, be the more distorted the more it was geared for his understanding. It is no coincidence that Rupert does not possess a scientific vocabulary, though he does possess a scientific as well as an intuitive mind. The very attempt to describe reality in scientific terms, as they are currently understood, pays my dear friend undue tribute to a vocabulary that automatically scales down greater concepts to fit its rigors. In other words, such attempts further compound the problem of considering a seemingly objective universe and describing it in an objective fashion. The universe is, and you can pick your terms, a spiritual or mental or psychological manifestation, and not, in your usual vocabulary, an objective manifestation. There is presently no science, religion, or philosophy that comes close to even approaching a conceptual framework that could explain or even indirectly describe the dimensions of that kind of universe. Its properties are psychological, following the logic of the psyche, and all of the physical properties that you understand are reflections of those deeper issues. Again, each atom and molecule and any particle that you can imagine possesses and would possess a consciousness. Unless you accept that statement, at least as a theory upon which to build, then much of my material would appear meaningless. That statement, therefore, must be the basis for any new scientific theories that hope to accomplish any performances at all leading to an acquisition of knowledge. And I want to interject something here from me, the reader. I am looking at light, and I've posted several videos of my pictures of light as orbs moving about, being full of all kinds of stuff. And I'm feeling so strongly that everything in light, well, is what makes up us, our bodies too. but that we are light looking at other light, that is us. But we don't recognize it as such because we think that only humans have consciousness, or animals or something else. But we don't see that each little photon of light is a consciousness. And here he seems to be talking about that. You must accept. Let me go back up. See what he said here. And this is all messed up. Sometimes they mess up the words. Its properties are psychological, following the logic of the psyche, and all of the physical properties that you understand are reflections of deeper issues. Again, each atom and molecule and any particle that you can imagine possesses and would possess a consciousness. So you see, I think the light that I'm filming is consciousness. And I know that when I say this, some people who view it, and I talk about that a little bit, they think I'm going bonkers. But I don't think I am. I think everything is consciousness, and it's God. It's a form of God consciousness. So I hope that some who like to have me read Seth material to them will also look at my videos I have where I show photons of light. I even have a friend in the light that I call Harry. He's a little spider-looking. I call him that because he looks sort of like a spider. He's got legs and hair. And he's unusual looking, and he drops down so often into the orb that I'm filming that I've come to look for him to drop down. And I've called him Harry, and sometimes I call to him when I don't see him. I say, Harry, show up, please. And sooner or later, after I call 4 or 5 times, he'll pop into an orb that I'm filming at the time. So there are other kinds of consciousnesses, and ones that we've never given any acknowledgement that they even exist. But I think it's about time that we do. Anyway, that's my little interjection. So check out some of my other videos. Some of the latest ones I'm doing are ones that show the light photons. And there's so many various names I've given to them, so just look at anything that has orbs on it that I have done, and you will see some of what I've made. Okay. Since I must use an objective vocabulary, I am always seeking for analogies. By objective, I refer to the use of language, the English language. That automatically sets up its own secrets of perception, as of course any language must do to some extent. The universe expands, as I've said before, as an idea expands, and as sentences are built upon words in your terms, and paragraphs upon sentences, and as each retains its own logic and continuity and evidence within that framework, so do all the portions of the universe appear to you also with the same cohesiveness, meaning, continuity, and order. Any sentence is meaningful. It seems to fall in order by itself as you say it. Its order is obvious. That one sentence is meaningful because of its organization of letters, or if it is spoken, its organization of vowels and syllables. It makes sense, however, not only because of the letters or vowels or syllables that are used within it, but because of all of the letters or vowels or syllables that it excludes. The same applies to your universe. It has meaning, coherence, and order, not only because of those realities that are obvious to you and that appear, but also because of those inner realities that are unspoken, are hidden. I am not speaking merely of hidden variables in scientific terms, nor am I saying that the universe is an illusion, but a psychological reality in which objectivity is the result of psychological creativity. it is not just that your view of reality is relative to your position within the universe, but that the universe itself is different according to your position within it, and that spiritual or psychological rules apply. The universe deals with different kinds of order, perceptions, and organizations, each dependent upon the others, yet each separate in its own domain. In your realm of reality, there is no real freedom but the freedom of ideas, and there is no real bondage except for bondage of ideals. For your ideals form your private and mass reality. You want to examine the universe from the outside, to examine your societies from the outside. You still think that the interior world is somehow symbolic, and the exterior world is real. That wars, for example, are fought by themselves or with bombs. All of the time, the psychological reality is the primary one that forms all of your events. Excuse me. It is not to say that you cannot understand the nature of the universe to some extent, but the answers lie in the natures of your own minds, in the processes of individual creativity, in studies that ask questions like, where did this thought come from? Where does it go? What effect does it have upon myself or others? How do I know how to dream when I have never been taught to do so? How do I speak without understanding the mechanisms? Why do I feel that I have an eternal reality when it is obvious that I was physically born and will physically die? Unscientific questions. I tell you that these are the most scientific of all. To some extent, the attempt on the part of science to consider such material may possibly bring about those qualities of true scientific intuition that will help science bridge the gap between such divergent views as its own and ours. And that was the end of that chapter. Excuse me. I have to drink a drink of water here. Chapter 8, Men, Molecules, Power, and Free Will. The regularly scheduled book session for last night was not held. We sat for it as usual, but became involved watching the last episode of a television miniseries about events growing out from the Watergate break-in. While we followed the drama, Jane reported to me a steady flow of comments about it from Seth. More often than not, he was quite amused as he gave them to her. She also picked up from him the heading for Chapter 8 for mass events: Men, Molecules, Power, and Free Will. We decided to reschedule the session for this evening. After supper tonight, however, Jane chose not to have the session because she felt so free and relaxed. Then a bit later, she spontaneously announced she'd hold it after all. Early, even. I don't know how long I can hold out, though, she said. I'm getting great bursts of stuff from Seth about all kinds of things. She described some of them to me, but I didn't have time to write them down and couldn't retain them. She laughed. She was very relaxed. Yet she launched into the session as easily as ever. I had to write fast to keep up with her delivery. Men, Molecules, Power, and Free Will. Before we end this particular section of the book dealing with frightened people, idealism, and interpretations of good and evil, there is another incident that I would like to mention. It is the Watergate affair. Last evening, Rupert and Joseph watched a television movie, a fictional dramatization of the Watergate events. Ordinarily, a session would have been held, but Rupert was interested in the movie, and I was interested in Rupert and Joseph's reactions to it. To some extent or another, I watched the program with our friends. Actually, I allowed myself to become aware mainly of Rupert's perceptions as he viewed the motion picture. By one of those curious coincidences that are not coincidences at all, another dramatic rendition of the same Watergate saga was simultaneously showing on another channel. This one depicting the second spiritual birth of one of the president's finest cohorts. Let us look briefly at that entire affair, remembering some of our earlier questions. When does an idealist turn into a fanatic, and how? And how can the desire to do good bring about catastrophic results? The president at the time, and through all of his life before, was at heart a stern, repressed idealist of a rather conventionally religious kind. He believed in an idealized good, while believing most firmly and simultaneously that man was fatally flawed, filled with evil, more naturally given to bad rather than good intent. He believed in the absolute necessity of power, while convinced at the same time that he did not possess it. And further, he believed that in the most basic terms, the individual was powerless to alter the devastating march of evil and corruption that he saw within the country and in all the other countries of the world. No matter how much power he achieved, it seemed to him that others had more, other people, other groups, other countries. But their power he saw as evil. And while he believed in the existence of an idealized good, he felt that the wicked were powerful and the good were weak and without vigor. He concentrated upon the vast gulf that seemed to separate the idealized good and the practical, ever-pervading corruption that in his eyes grew by leaps and bounds. He saw himself as just. Those who did not agree with him he saw as moral enemies. Eventually it seemed to him that he was surrounded by the corrupt, and that any means at his disposal was justified to bring down those who would threaten the presidency or the state. He was as paranoid as any poor deluded man or woman is who feels without evidence that he or she is being pursued by creatures from space, earthly or terrestrial enemies, or evil psychic powers. Those poor people will build up for themselves a logical sequence of events in which the most innocent encounter is turned into a frightening threat. They will project that fear outward until they seem to meet it in each person they encounter. It is obvious to most others that such paranoid views are not based on mass fact. Your president at that time, however, had at his command vast information, so that he was aware of many groups and organizations that did not agree with his policies. He used those as in other circumstances. A paranoid might use the sight of a police car to convince himself that he was being pursued by the police or the FBI or whatever. The president felt threatened, not only personally threatened, for he felt that the good for which he stood in his own mind was in peril. And again, since the idealized good seemed too remote and difficult to achieve, any means was justified. Those who followed him in the cabinet and so forth possessed the same kinds of characteristics to some degree or another. No one is as fanatical, and no one can be more cruel than the self-righteous. It is very easy for such persons to become religiously converted after such episodes as Watergate, lining themselves up once more on the side of good, searching for the power of fellowship, turning to church rather than government, hearing in one way or another the voice of God. So how can the well-meaning idealist know whether or not his good intent will lead to some actualization? How can he know, or how can she know, whether or not this good intent might in fact lead to disastrous conditions? When does the idealist turn into a fanatic? Look at it this way. If someone tells you that pleasure is wrong and tolerance is weakness, and that you must follow this or that dogma blindly in obedience, And if you are told this is the only right road toward the idealized good, then most likely you are dealing with a fanatic. If you are told to kill for the sake of peace, you are dealing with someone who does not understand peace or justice. If you are told to give up your free will, you are dealing with a fanatic. Both men and molecules dwell in a field of probabilities, and their paths are not determined. The vast reality of probabilities makes the existence of free will possible. If probabilities did not exist, and if you were not to some degree aware of probable actions and events, not only could you not choose between them, but you would not, of course, have any feeling of choice. You would be unaware of the entire issue. Through your mundane conscious choices, you affect all of the events of your world, so that the mass world is the result of multitudinous individual choices. You could not make choices at all if you did not feel impulses to do this or that, so that choices usually involve you in making decisions between various impulses. Impulses are urges toward action. Some are conscious and some are not. Each cell of your body feels the impulse toward action, response, and communication. You have been taught not to trust your impulses. Now, impulses, however, help you to develop events of natural power. Impulses in children teach them to develop their muscles and minds, each in their own unique manner. And as you will see, those impulses of a private nature are nevertheless also based upon the greater situation of the species and the planet, so that ideally the fulfillment of the individual would automatically lead to the better good of the species. Now, Seth began some material on other matters, then ended the session. I sat working on my notes for the beginning of the session while Jane left the room. When she returned, she said she had things to tell me. I think it started with Seth, but then I went into another altered state of my own, like the time I got that dream material at the kitchen table. When was that? Last March? Jane began to dictate what she'd just received. This certainly wasn't Seth coming through. Her voice was rather conversational, yet at the same time it was deliberate in a way quite different from her usual manner of speaking. I began to write. As you learn to trust your natural impulses, they introduce you to your individual sense of power, so that you realize that your own actions do have meaning, that you do affect events, and that you can see some definite signs that you are achieving good ends. The idealized goal isn't as remote then because it is being expressed. Even if that expression is by means of steps, you can point toward it as an accomplishment. Previously, we distrusted our own impulses to such an extent that they often appeared to be in a very distorted form. Jane said, "That's it as far as I got it, but the idea that each person tries to actualize the idealized good as much as they can through their daily lives, their work, social structures, and so forth, and in the meantime use certain criteria that will help them judge for themselves whether or not their actions are really in line with their ideas. The criteria are actually the ones given in the chapter. That's all. A whole lot of it was coming to me. I don't even know if it's right. Oh, that reminds me," she added. "Remember that letter we got today from a reader about pollution? I picked up something about that, too. The real question, for example, isn't one of planetary pollution or nuclear waste, but the beliefs that make such questions even arise, and the attitudes that see an idealized good worth such risk. That is, people aren't polluting the world out of greed alone, but for the economic good of all. It's just that the means they often choose aren't justified by those ends." I'm going to skip through that part. Almost 2 full months have passed since Unit Number 2, one of the 2 reactors in Pennsylvania's 3 Mile Island nuclear power generating plant, overheated and came close to a catastrophic meltdown of its uranium fuel. The situation at TMI is enigmatic as ever, with the damaged reactor's massive containment building sealed and holding within it large amounts of highly radioactive gases, solids, and water. The contaminated water, some 600,000 gallons of it, floods the building basement in a pool at least 6 feet deep. There's plenty of action outside the 3 Mile Island, however, with all of the investigations into the accident underway or planned. Scary stories abound about our nuclear dilemmas, ranging from tales of poorly designed plants, control rooms, and instruments, to the failure to promptly report potentially serious accidents, to the fact that in 1978, every one of the country's more than 70 nuclear power plants had at least one unexpected shutdown because of procedural errors, mechanical failures, or both. The increasing dependence of the United States upon nuclear power is being deeply questioned, even though that energy is supposed to help alleviate our growing reliance upon foreign oil. There's worry about the plants emitting constant radiation and about their vulnerability to damage by sabotage, more likely fires. About who's to pay for expensive nuclear accidents. Suits and countersuits are inevitable, processes that can continue for years. There will be fines and many tighter industry rules and regulations. And in all of the concern for safety, there's much irony. For 3 Mile Island and the people of eastern Pennsylvania were saved not by the plant's emergency cooling systems, but by non-safety related equipment that plant operators finally used to improvise cooling of the reactor's overheated core. Beneath all of the frustrations and upsets we may feel at their surface manifestations, Jane and I are caught up in the deeper meanings of events like those in Jonestown and TMI, for they represent great challenges that our species has set for itself through the century and beyond. Science and religion must ultimately be reconciled if we are to progress. These challenges aren't just national, of course, but worldwide. The scientific rationale embodied in TMI runs headlong into the Western world's reliance upon energy supplies. TMI is 3 Mile Island. Mainly oil. Mainly oil from nations that are largely religiously oriented and that profess all kinds of antipathy for social orders other than their own. In our lifetimes, Jane and I look forward to our species at least making a start at grappling with such large areas of its own activity as science and religion. We must come to terms with those challenges we've created and are creating. Early in the morning on June 17, 1972, 5 men were arrested inside the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee, located in the Washington, D.C. apartment hotel office complex known as the Watergate. The men were employed by the Plumbers, a secret group working for the Republican President Richard Nixon's committee to re-elect the president, and their tasks were to photograph records and to check upon listening devices, bugs, that had been planted in the offices during a first illegal entry in May. The detection of the break-in at Watergate both uncovered and perpetuated a labyrinth series of events that culminated in the resignation of President Nixon on August 9, 1974. Next session is session number 857, and I'm going to skip down this part. Good evening. Good evening, Seth. Dictation. Impulses, therefore, provide impetus toward motion, coaxing the physical body and the mental person toward utilization of physical and mental power. They help the individual impress the world, that is, to act upon it and within it effectively. Impulses also open up choices that may not have been consciously available before. I have said that cells precognate, and that at that level the body is aware of vast information. Cellular information, I guess you're talking about. Information not consciously known or apprehended. The universe and everything within it is composed of information, but this information is awareized, containing, and maybe one of their mess-ups. I don't know what that means. But this information is awareized, containing, I am sorry. Information concerning the entire universe is always latent within each and every part of it. The motive power of the universe and of each particle or wave or person within it is the magnificent thrust toward creative probabilities and the tension that exists, the exuberant tension that exists between probable choices and probable events. This applies to men and molecules, and to all of those hypothetically theorized smaller divisions with which scientists like to amaze themselves. Divisions are units. In more mundane terms, impulses often come from unconscious knowledge then. This knowledge is spontaneously and automatically received by the energy that composes your body, and then it is processed so that pertinent information applying to you can be taken advantage of. Ideally, your impulses are always in response to your own best interest, and again, to the best interest of your world as well. Obviously, there is a deep, damaging distrust of impulses in the contemporary world, as in your terms there has been throughout the history that you follow. Impulses are spontaneous, and you have been taught not to trust the spontaneous portions of your being, but to rely upon your reason and your intellect, which both operate incidentally, quite spontaneously, by the way. When you let yourselves alone, you are spontaneously reasonable, but because of your beliefs it seems that reason and spontaneity make poor bedfellows. Psychologically, your impulses are as vital to your being as your physical organs are. They are as altruistic or unselfish as your physical organs are. And I would like that sentence read several times. And yet each impulse is suited and tailored directly to the individual who feels it. Ideally, by following your impulses, you would feel the impulsive shape of your life. You would not spend time wondering what your purpose was, for it would make itself known to you as you perceived the direction in which your natural impulses led, and felt yourself exert power in the world through such actions. Again, impulses are doorways to action. Satisfaction, the exertion of natural, mental, and physical power,